Jacob stands bare-chested in lamplight, trembling as Caleb's palm presses against his racing heart. "My brother had his turn with you this week." Caleb's voice drops to a growl. "Now it's mine to show you what comes next." Matthias watches from the shadows, silent and hungry. 3 men, 1 isolated ranch, a decision that changes everything. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The dust hung thick in the air the day Jacob arrived at the Dalton Ranch, nothing more than a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder and a letter of introduction clutched in his sunburned hand. He was 19, lean from months of wandering, his clothes patched and faded from too many nights sleeping rough under unforgiving stars. The journey had taken 3 weeks on foot, following directions scrawled on the back of a saloon napkin by old Miller, a grizzled trader who'd taken pity on him in the last town. "Walk north until you see the Twin Peaks," Miller had said, his whiskey breath hot against Jacob's ear. "Then follow the creek west. The Dalton brothers will take you on if you're willing to work hard and keep your mouth shut about their business." Jacob hadn't asked what business needed keeping quiet. He'd learned long ago that curiosity was a luxury for men with full bellies and warm beds. For someone like him, perpetually one missed meal away from starvation, questions were an indulgence he couldn't afford. The ranch stretched out before him like a promise, acres of golden wheat swaying in the late afternoon breeze, cattle dotting the distant hills like scattered stones. The main house stood 2 stories tall, built from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smaller structures clustered nearby, a barn that could house a dozen horses, a smokehouse, what looked like a bunkhouse, and various sheds whose purposes Jacob could only guess at. But it was the 2 figures standing at the barn entrance that made his breath catch. "Brothers," the letter had said, "twin ranchers who needed an extra pair of hands for the harvest season." What the letter hadn't mentioned was how they would look at him. Caleb stood to the left, broader through the shoulders, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and darkened by the sun. His jaw was square, shadowed with stubble that was just beginning to show traces of silver, despite him appearing no older than 30. Dark hair fell across his forehead, perpetually disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of blue that caught the light when he tilted his head. When those eyes swept over Jacob, there was an assessment there that made Jacob's skin prickle with awareness. Not the casual once-over of an employer evaluating a potential worker, but something deeper, more penetrating, something that felt almost predatory. In its intensity, Matthias was on the right, taller by an inch, leaner but no less imposing. Where Caleb seemed built for raw power, Matthias had the look of a man who relied on precision and endurance. His features were slightly softer, his eyes a shade lighter, more hazel than gray. His hands, Jacob noticed, were elegant despite their obvious strength, the fingers long and capable looking. His gaze was quieter than his brother's, more careful, but it lingered just as long, traveling from Jacob's dusty boots to his nervous eyes, with an intensity that felt almost physical, like a touch against his skin. Jacob shifted his weight, suddenly conscious of how he must appear after weeks on the road. His hair needed cutting, hung past his collar in tangled waves. His clothes, though clean, were threadbare and ill-fitting, bought second-hand from a charity barrel. His face was gaunt, cheekbones too prominent, eyes too large for his thin features. He looked like what he was, a drifter, desperate and alone. "You're the farmhand old Miller sent?" Caleb's voice was rough like gravel under wagon wheels, but there was something underneath it, a warmth that didn't quite match his stern expression. Jacob nodded, fighting the urge to step backward. "Yes, sir. Jacob Brennan. The letter said you needed help with the harvest and—" "We know what the letter said?" Matthias stepped forward, and Jacob caught the scent of hay and leather and something warmer, something indefinably human, that made his stomach clench with an unfamiliar sensation. "Question is whether you can handle the work." There was a challenge in those words, something unspoken threading beneath the surface. Jacob had heard challenges before, from men who thought his youth and slight build made him easy prey. He'd learned to meet them head-on, to show no weakness even when his knees wanted to buckle. Jacob lifted his chin, meeting Matthias's gaze directly. I can handle whatever you need." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something Jacob couldn't name. It reminded him of the air before a thunderstorm, electric and expectant, making the hair on his arms stand on end. Caleb's mouth curved into the slightest smile, and Matthias exchanged a glance with his brother that Jacob couldn't read, but that seemed to communicate volumes. Some shared understanding passed between them, an entire conversation conducted in the space of a heartbeat. "We'll see about that," Caleb said finally, his tone giving nothing away. "You'll bunk in the loft above the barn. Supper's at sundown. Don't be late." As Jacob climbed the ladder to the hayloft that would be his home, he felt their eyes on him still, twin weights pressing against his spine. He told himself it was just the usual scrutiny any new hire would receive, the natural wariness of employers toward an unknown worker. But deep down, in a place he barely acknowledged even to himself, he knew it was something else entirely. Something that made his pulse quicken and his hands tremble as he unpacked his few belongings. Something that whispered this ranch would change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The loft was Spartan but clean. A narrow cot with a thin mattress and wool blanket occupied one corner. A wooden crate served as a makeshift table, and someone had left a basin and pitcher for washing. A small window at the far end let in the golden afternoon light, and Jacob could see clear across the wheat fields from this vantage point. He sat on the edge of the cot and allowed himself a moment of stillness. The journey here had been brutal. He'd walked until his feet bled, slept in ditches and under bridges, gone days with nothing but wild berries and creek water to sustain him. There had been moments when he'd considered giving up entirely, when the weight of loneliness and despair had felt too heavy to carry another step. But something had kept him moving forward. Some stubborn core of determination that refused to let the world grind him down completely. Now, sitting in this quiet loft with the promise of steady work and regular meals, Jacob felt the tension begin to drain from his shoulders. Maybe finally he could stop running. Maybe here, in this remote corner of the frontier, he could find something resembling peace. The sound of approaching footsteps on the ladder made him stiffen. He stood quickly, uncertain whether he should appear to be working or resting, unsure of the protocol in this new place. Matthias's head appeared through the opening in the floor, and he pulled himself up with easy grace. He carried a bundle in his arms, which he set down on the cot. "Thought you might need these," he said, his voice gentler than it had been outside. "Shirts and trousers that should fit well enough. Water gets cold at night this time of year, so there's a heavier coat in there too." Jacob stared at the offering, throat tight. I can pay you back. Out of my wages, I mean." Matthias shook his head. "No need. We've got more than we use. Consider it part of your hiring on." He paused, studying Jacob with that quiet intensity. "When's the last time you ate?" Jacob tried to remember. Yesterday, the day before. Time had blurred during the final stretch of his journey. "I had some dried meat this morning," he lied. Matthias's expression suggested he didn't believe that for a second, but he didn't challenge it. "Supper's in an hour. Come down to the house when you hear the bell." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Jacob?" "Yes, sir?" "You don't need to call us sir. Caleb and Matthias will do just fine." Something flickered in his eyes, something Jacob couldn't quite interpret. "We're not that much older than you. This isn't the army." After Matthias descended the ladder, Jacob examined the clothes. They were well made, far better quality than anything he'd owned in years. The shirts were soft cotton, worn smooth from many washings but free of holes or patches. The trousers were heavy denim, sturdy enough for hard labor. And the coat. Jacob ran his fingers over the thick wool, feeling its weight and warmth. These weren't cast-offs or charity. These were good clothes, cared for and valued. Why would they give such things to a stranger? The question troubled him as he changed into one of the shirts and a pair of trousers that fit surprisingly well, as though they'd been made for someone his exact size. He washed his face and hands in the basin, scrubbing away layers of road dust, and used his fingers to comb through his tangled hair. When the dinner bell rang, a clear chime that carried across the yard, Jacob descended the ladder with his heart in his throat. The main house was warmer than he'd expected, heat radiating from a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the front room. The space was tidy without being fussy, furnished with handcrafted furniture that showed signs of careful use. Books lined shelves near the fireplace, more books than Jacob had seen outside of a town library. The brothers stood when he entered, another small courtesy that surprised him. In his experience, ranch owners didn't stand for hired help. "Sit," Caleb said, gesturing to a chair at the long wooden table. "Matthias cooked, so if you get sick, blame him." Matthias snorted. "Caleb can't boil water without burning it. You're lucky I handle the kitchen." The easy banter between them was unexpected, and Jacob found himself relaxing slightly as he took his seat. The meal was simple but abundant. Roasted chicken, boiled potatoes, fresh bread that steamed when Matthias cut into it, and green beans from their garden. There was butter and honey, strong coffee, and even an apple pie for dessert. Jacob tried to eat slowly, to not betray how hungry he truly was, but his body betrayed him. He finished his first plate faster than he intended, and before he could stop himself, he was eyeing the serving dishes with barely concealed longing. "Have more," Matthias said quietly, already reaching for Jacob's plate. "There's plenty." Jacob ate 3 full helpings, more food than he'd consumed in the past week combined. By the time he pushed back from the table, his stomach was uncomfortably full, but the sensation was blissful after so long, with the gnawing ache of hunger as his constant companion. "Thank you," he managed, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could convey. That was, "Thank you." Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying Jacob over the rim of his coffee cup. "You've been on the road a while." It wasn't a question, but Jacob answered anyway. "Few months, since spring." "Family?" Matthias asked. "None that claim me." The words came out more bitter than Jacob intended. He'd learned not to think about his father, about the night he'd been thrown out with nothing but the clothes on his back and his father's curses ringing in his ears. That belonged to another life, another version of himself. The brothers exchanged another of those loaded glances. Caleb set down his cup with careful precision. "Out here, we don't ask a man about his past unless he offers to share it. What matters is who you are now and what you're willing to become." There was weight to those words, layers of meaning Jacob couldn't quite unpack. He nodded, unsure what response was expected. "The work starts at dawn," Matthias said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. "We'll spend tomorrow getting you oriented to the ranch, showing you where everything is and what needs doing. The real harvest begins the day after. You'll work alongside us from sunup to sundown. It's hard labor, no point pretending otherwise." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Jacob said. Caleb's smile was sharp. "We'll see. Most men say that right up until their first day of real work breaks them." It sounded like another challenge, and Jacob felt his spine stiffen in response. "I won't break." "No," Matthias said softly, his eyes warm as they rested on Jacob's face. "I don't think you will." After supper, Jacob helped wash the dishes, despite Matthias's protests. It felt important somehow, to contribute, to prove his worth beyond just showing up. Caleb sat by the fire, ostensibly reading, but Jacob caught him watching more than once, his gaze heavy and considering. When the work was done, Matthias walked Jacob to the barn, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the yard. The night air was cool, fresh with the scent of growing things and distant rain. "Sleep well," Matthias said at the base of the ladder. "Tomorrow will be long, but it'll give you a sense of what you've signed on for." Jacob nodded, one foot on the bottom rung. He hesitated, then turned back. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you hire me? You didn't ask for references, didn't question my experience. For all you know, I could be running from the law." Matthias was quiet for a long moment, the lantern light flickering across his features. "Are you? Running from the law?" "No." "Then that's all we need to know." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "This ranch is isolated, Jacob. We're miles from the nearest town, days from any real civilization. Out here, we rely on instinct more than credentials, and our instinct says you're someone who deserves a chance. But why? What did you see that made you so certain? Matthias stepped closer, and in the confined space between the barn wall and the ladder, Jacob could feel the heat radiating from his body. We saw someone who's been tested by the world and survived, someone who's learned to endure. That's worth more than any reference letter. His hand rose, and for a moment Jacob thought he might touch him, but Matthias merely adjusted the lantern's handle. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." Jacob climbed to the loft, his mind spinning. He lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling beams, trying to make sense of the strange currents he felt flowing beneath every interaction with the brothers. They were kind, certainly, generous with food and clothing and patience. But there was something else, something in the way they looked at him, the way they spoke to him, something that made his skin feel too tight and his breath come too quick. Jacob had spent his entire life learning to read danger, to sense when someone's interest in him came with hidden costs. But this didn't feel like danger exactly. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, unable to see the bottom, but unable to step away either. Sleep came eventually, fitful and filled with fragmented dreams. The first week passed in a blur of back-breaking labor. Jacob woke before dawn to the sound of roosters and worked until his muscles screamed for mercy. He hauled water from the well until his shoulders burned, mended fences until his hands were covered in splinters, mucked out stalls until his back felt ready to snap. He learned to milk cows, to feed chickens, to identify which tools went with which tasks. The brothers worked alongside him, never asking him to do anything they wouldn't do themselves. Caleb attacked every job with fierce energy, as though the work were a personal enemy to be conquered. He moved with explosive power, swinging an axe or hauling timber with an intensity that was almost frightening. Matthias was different, working with quiet precision and endless patience. He showed Jacob how to properly sharpen a blade, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to coax a skittish horse to trust. His movements were economical, never wasted, and he could work for hours without seeming to tire. But more than the work itself, Jacob learned other things. He learned that Caleb's gruffness masked a surprisingly quick mind, evidenced by the books Jacob sometimes saw him reading by firelight, volumes of philosophy and poetry that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. He learned that Matthias hummed while he worked, unconscious melodies that drifted across the fields and somehow made the labor feel less burdensome. He learned that both of them watched him constantly. It was never obvious, never crude. Just a glance held a moment too long when Jacob bent to lift a heavy sack. A hand that lingered on his shoulder when Caleb corrected his grip on an axe, fingers warm through the thin cotton of his shirt. The way Matthias stood too close when showing him how to properly bridle a skittish mare, his breath warm against Jacob's neck as he murmured instructions, his body a solid presence against Jacob's back. Jacob told himself he was imagining it, that his own loneliness and inexperience were painting meaning onto innocent gestures. But then came the night everything shifted. He'd been working late in the barn, restacking hay bales that had shifted during the day. The work was hot, dusty, and sweat soaked through his shirt within minutes. Without thinking about it, he'd peeled the garment off and worked bare-chested in the dim lamplight, grateful for even the slight relief from the oppressive heat. He didn't hear Caleb approach until the man's voice cut through the quiet, rough, and low in a way that made Jacob's stomach flip. "You work hard for someone so young." Jacob spun, heart hammering against his ribs. Caleb stood in the doorway, silhouetted by moonlight, his expression unreadable in shadow. How long had he been standing there, watching? "Just trying to earn my keep, sir." "Caleb," the rancher corrected, stepping inside. The lamplight caught his features, revealing an intensity in his gaze that made Jacob's mouth go dry. "No need for formalities when it's just us." The way he said "just us" made something flutter in Jacob's chest, a sensation he couldn't name but that felt dangerously close to anticipation. Jacob reached for his discarded shirt, suddenly conscious of his bare skin, of the way Caleb's eyes had dropped to his exposed torso. But Caleb's next words stopped him mid-motion. "Leave it. You'll just soak through another one." It wasn't a request. There was command in his voice, an expectation of obedience that Jacob found himself unable to resist. Caleb moved closer, and Jacob forced himself to stand still, to not retreat like a nervous colt, even though every instinct screamed at him to put distance between them. The older man's eyes traveled over him slowly, taking in the lean muscles earned from months of hard travel and a week of ranch work, the pale skin that had only recently begun to bronze under the relentless sun. "You filled out some since you arrived," Caleb observed, his voice lower now, almost contemplative. "Good food and steady work suit you." Jacob swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet barn. "Thank you. My brothers noticed too." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jacob's mouth went dry, his pulse thundering in his ears. "I don't understand what you're—" "Yes, you do." Caleb closed the remaining distance, and Jacob could see his eyes now, dark and intense, and fixed on him with a focus that made breathing difficult. "You're young, Jacob, but you're not stupid. You felt it, the way we look at you, the way you look back when you think we're not paying attention." Heat flooded Jacob's face, shame and something else, something that felt like want but couldn't possibly be. He wanted to deny it, to protect himself with lies, but the words stuck in his throat. Caleb reached out, and Jacob flinched slightly, an involuntary response born from too many years of learning. That touch often preceded pain. But the contact when it came was surprisingly gentle, just fingertips trailing along his collarbone, tracing the line of his shoulder with something approaching reverence. "There's no shame in it," Caleb murmured, his voice rough with restrained emotion. "Out here, we make our own rules, live by our own codes. What happens on this ranch stays on this ranch. No judgment, no consequences beyond what we choose for ourselves." Jacob's breath came faster, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Your brother? Matthias knows his own mind, as do I." Caleb's hand settled on the back of Jacob's neck, warm and possessive, fingers threading through the hair at his nape. "The question is, do you know yours?" Before Jacob could answer, footsteps sounded on the barn floor, deliberate and unhurried. Caleb stepped back smoothly, his expression shifting to something more neutral, though his eyes still burned with that fierce intensity. Matthias appeared in the lamplight, his gaze moving immediately to Jacob's bare chest, then to his brother's face. Something passed between the twins, some silent communication Jacob couldn't decipher, but that seemed to resolve some unspoken question. "Getting late," Matthias said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "Jacob should rest. Tomorrow's the start of harvest proper. He'll need his strength." There was meaning layered in those words, something that made Jacob's skin prickle with awareness. But he couldn't parse what it was. Caleb nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off Jacob. "You're right. Go on, boy. Get some sleep." Jacob grabbed his shirt and fled to the loft, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Behind him, he heard the low murmur of the brothers' voices, too quiet to make out words but rich with intent. That night, Jacob lay awake in the darkness, staring at the rough wooden beams above him. His body felt strange, alive with sensations he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. Every place Caleb had touched seemed to burn with residual heat, and his mind kept returning to the moment when those fingers had traced his collarbone, so gentle it had made him want to lean into the contact rather than pull away. And tomorrow, the harvest would begin. Tomorrow he would be working beside both of them from dawn until dusk, their bodies moving in rhythm with his, their attention focused and unrelenting. Jacob closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, but sleep was a long time coming. He had come to this ranch looking for honest work and a place to belong. He was beginning to suspect he would find much more than that, and the thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure, a contradiction he had no framework to understand, but could no longer deny. The days that followed took on a strange quality, as though Jacob were living in two worlds simultaneously. On the surface, everything continued as normal. He woke before dawn, worked until his muscles ached, ate meals with the brothers, and fell into exhausted sleep each night. The routine was comforting in its predictability, giving structure to days that might otherwise have felt untethered. But beneath that surface, currents pulled and shifted. Every interaction with Caleb and Matthias now carried additional weight, layers of meaning that Jacob was only beginning to parse. A simple instruction about feeding the livestock became something more when Caleb's hand lingered on his shoulder. A lesson in repairing fence posts transformed when Matthias stood close enough that Jacob could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The brothers seemed to be engaged in some unspoken negotiation, circling around Jacob with careful precision. Sometimes they worked together, their attention combining in ways that left Jacob breathless. Other times they took turns as though each wanted their own time to study him, to learn the contours of his responses. Jacob found himself hyper-aware of his own body in ways he'd never experienced. The flex of his muscles as he lifted a water bucket, the way sweat traced down his spine during afternoon work, the sound of his own breathing in the quiet moments between tasks. It was as though Caleb and Matthias's constant observation had awakened something dormant, teaching him to see himself through their eyes. One afternoon, while Jacob was repairing a section of the barn roof, he became aware of being watched. Looking down, he saw Caleb standing in the yard below, arms crossed, face tilted up toward where Jacob balanced on the edge. The older man made no attempt to hide his scrutiny, and when their eyes met, he didn't look away. "Careful up there," Caleb called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "That edge is rotted through in places." Jacob nodded, returning his attention to the shingles, but he could still feel Caleb's gaze like a physical presence, tracking his every movement. It should have made him nervous, should have caused him to fumble. Instead, he found himself moving with more confidence, more precision, as though performing for an audience he desperately wanted to impress. When he climbed down the ladder 20 minutes later, Caleb was waiting at the bottom. He didn't step back as Jacob descended, forcing Jacob to navigate around him in the narrow space between ladder and barn wall. Their bodies brushed as Jacob turned, and Caleb's hand came up to steady him, gripping his hip with casual possession. "You're getting good at that," Caleb observed, his voice low. "Learning fast." "I had good teachers," Jacob managed, acutely aware of the heat of Caleb's palm burning through his trousers. Caleb's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're an eager student. That helps." His thumb stroked once, twice, against Jacob's hip bone. "Matthias says you ask questions, want to understand not just how to do things, but why. That's rare." Jacob swallowed hard. "I don't want to make mistakes." "Everyone makes mistakes." Caleb's other hand rose, brushing dust from Jacob's shoulder with unnecessary thoroughness. "The question is whether you learn from them or repeat them." There was meaning buried in those words, something about more than just ranch work. Jacob searched Caleb's face, trying to decode the message, but the older man's expression gave nothing away. "I try to learn," Jacob said quietly. "I know you do." Caleb's hand finally fell away from his hip, though his fingers trailed along Jacob's side as they went, a deliberate caress disguised as casual touch. "That's one of the things I like about you." He walked away before Jacob could respond, leaving him standing by the ladder with his heart racing and his skin tingling where Caleb had touched him. That night at supper, Matthias seemed to sense the shift in energy. He kept glancing between Jacob and his brother, his expression thoughtful. When Caleb excused himself early, citing work to finish in the barn, Matthias gestured for Jacob to stay seated. "More coffee?" he offered, already reaching for the pot. Jacob nodded, though he'd already had 2 cups and knew the caffeine would keep him awake. But the alternative was retreating to the loft, and he found himself reluctant to leave Matthias's company. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl. Finally, Matthias spoke. "My brother can be intense. If he's making you uncomfortable, you need to tell me." Jacob considered lying, offering easy reassurance, but something about Matthias's steady gaze demanded honesty. "He's not making me uncomfortable. Not exactly." "What then?" "I don't know." Jacob stared into his coffee cup, watching the lamplight reflect off the dark surface. "I feel like I'm always waiting for something to happen, but I don't know what it is or when it will come." Matthias was quiet for a long moment. When Jacob looked up, he found the older man studying him with an expression that was part sympathy, part something else, something that looked almost like hunger. "That's anticipation," Matthias said softly. "The space between wanting and having. It's not a comfortable place to live." "No," Jacob agreed. "It's not. But it can be sweet in its own way. Knowing something is coming, feeling it build. Sometimes the anticipation is more powerful than the fulfillment." Jacob's mouth went dry. "Is that what this is? You're both making me anticipate something?" Matthias leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Jacob's face. "We're giving you time to understand what you want, to come to it on your own terms rather than being rushed or pushed. Caleb thinks I'm being too cautious, that I'm drawing it out unnecessarily. But I believe some things are worth the wait." "And what do I think?" Jacob asked, surprised by his own boldness. "Does anyone care what I want?" "Of course we care." Matthias leaned forward again, elbows on the table. "That's the only thing we care about, Jacob. Your choice, your willingness. We can show you possibilities, help you understand what's being offered, but the decision has to be yours. What if I don't know how to decide? What if I've never even thought about this kind of thing before? Then you think about it now." Matthias reached across the table, his hand covering Jacob's where it rested beside his coffee cup. His palm was warm, calloused, and his touch sent electricity racing up Jacob's arm. "You feel what you feel, want what you want. There's no shame in any of it out here. No judgment, just honest desire between people who respect each other." Jacob stared at their joined hands, at the contrast between Matthias's sun-darkened skin and his own paler flesh. "And if what I feel scares me? Fear is natural. It means you understand the stakes, the significance of what's happening." Matthias's thumb stroked across Jacob's knuckles, the gesture tender and possessive at once. "But don't let fear make your decisions for you. Don't let it rob you of something you might want just because it's unfamiliar." They sat like that for several minutes, hands joined across the scarred wooden table, the lamplight flickering between them. Jacob felt something shift inside him, some final resistance beginning to crumble. He'd spent so long running, hiding, denying himself anything that might make him vulnerable. And where had it gotten him? To the edge of starvation? To the brink of despair? These men were offering him something different. Not just safety and sustenance, but genuine connection. The chance to be known, fully and completely, and accepted anyway. "I should get some sleep," Jacob said finally, though he made no move to pull his hand away. "You should," Matthias agreed, also not moving. "Tomorrow's another full day." Eventually, Jacob did withdraw, standing on legs that felt unsteady. Matthias rose with him, walking him to the door. In the threshold, he paused, turning back. "Thank you," Jacob said, "for the patience, for giving me time." Matthias smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger despite the silver threading his hair. "We've got all the time in the world, Jacob. There's no rush." But as Jacob climbed to the loft and lay in his narrow cot, staring at the darkness above him, he wondered if that was true, because the tension building inside him felt like a storm gathering strength, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could withstand the pressure before something broke. Tomorrow the real harvest would begin. Tomorrow he would spend the entire day working between both brothers, their bodies moving in rhythm with his, their attention focused and unrelenting. And Jacob suspected that tomorrow something would change. The slow build of these past weeks was reaching a crescendo, and whether he was ready or not, the moment of decision was approaching. He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, but sleep was a long time coming. And when it finally arrived, it brought dreams that left him aching and confused, fragments of sensation and desire that he couldn't quite remember but that clung to him like morning fog. The ranch was teaching him about himself, revealing truths he'd spent years avoiding, and the Dalton brothers, with their patient hands and hungry eyes, were the ones guiding him through that revelation. Whatever came next, Jacob knew he would never be the same. That boy who'd arrived here with nothing but desperate hope was already gone, replaced by someone beginning to understand what it meant to be wanted, to be valued, to belong. And terrifying as that transformation was, Jacob found he didn't want to go back. Couldn't go back, even if he tried. The door to his old life had closed behind him, and ahead lay territory unmapped and uncertain. But he wouldn't be walking into it alone. That, at least, was a comfort worth clinging to as the night stretched on and morning crept closer. The harvest moon rose blood-red over the wheat fields, casting long shadows across the Dalton ranch. Jacob stood at the edge of the barn, watching the brothers prepare the equipment for tomorrow's work. 3 days had passed since that night with Caleb. 3 days of loaded glances and casual touches that felt anything but casual. Matthias had grown bolder. Where Caleb was direct and commanding, Matthias worked with patience, a slow encroachment that left Jacob breathless. Yesterday, while teaching Jacob to sharpen the scythe blades, Matthias had stood behind him, his chest pressed against Jacob's back, his hands guiding the younger man's grip along the whetstone. The lesson had lasted far longer than necessary, and when it ended, Jacob's hands had been trembling. The previous afternoon, Matthias had shown him how to oil the leather harnesses, their shoulders touching as they worked side by side in the tack room. Every few minutes, Matthias would reach across him for a tool or cloth, his arm brushing against Jacob's chest, the contact brief but electric. And once, when Jacob had fumbled a buckle, Matthias had caught his hands, stilling them with gentle pressure. "Slow down," he'd murmured, his mouth so close to Jacob's ear that his breath had raised goosebumps along Jacob's neck. "There's no need to rush. Take your time, feel the leather, understand how it wants to move." His fingers had guided Jacob's, showing him the proper motion, and the entire time Jacob's heart had hammered so loud he was certain Matthias could hear it. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb called out from the barn entrance, "Jacob, come here. Need to show you something." Jacob's pulse quickened. He crossed the yard, aware of Matthias watching from where he worked on the wagon wheel, his hands stilling on the tools as he tracked Jacob's movement. Inside the barn, Caleb stood beside a mountain of grain sacks, lamplight flickering across his weathered features, catching in the silver threads at his temples. "Tomorrow we start cutting," Caleb said, his voice measured and low. "The work will be hard, harder than anything you've done so far. You'll be working between me and Matthias, keeping pace with both of us. Think you can handle that?" The double meaning wasn't lost on Jacob. His throat felt tight as he answered, "I can handle it." Caleb stepped closer, and Jacob caught that scent again, hay and sweat and something uniquely him, masculine and earthy. "My brother's gone soft on you. Thinks we should take our time, let you come to us on your own terms." "And you?" Jacob's voice came out rougher than he intended, betraying the effect Caleb's proximity was having on him. "I think a man knows what he wants when he sees it, and I think you've been wanting since the day you arrived, even if you won't admit it to yourself." Caleb's hand rose, fingers brushing along Jacob's jaw with surprising gentleness. The calluses on his palm rasped against Jacob's skin, a reminder of the strength those hands possessed. "Tell me I'm wrong." Jacob couldn't speak. His throat had closed up entirely, every rational thought fleeing in the face of Caleb's intensity. "That's what I thought." Caleb's thumb traced the curve of Jacob's lower lip, gentle but possessive, claiming the territory it explored. "Matthias stretched you out slow these past few days, getting you used to the idea of us, teaching you not to flinch when we touch you, making you comfortable with our hands on you, our voices in your ear." Jacob's breath hitched, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "But comfortable isn't what you need, is it?" Caleb leaned in, his mouth so close to Jacob's ear that each word felt like a physical touch, a promise and a threat combined. "You need someone to push you past that comfort, past the fear, someone to show you what you're really capable of feeling." Before Jacob could respond, Matthias's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Caleb, leave him be for tonight." Caleb pulled back with visible reluctance, his eyes still locked on Jacob's face, searching for something. "My brother's mercy is a rare thing. You should be grateful." Jacob watched Caleb walk away, his legs unsteady beneath him. Matthias approached slowly, his expression unreadable in the lamplight, shadows playing across his features. "Don't mind him," Matthias said quietly, his tone soothing. "Caleb's always been impatient, wants everything right now, consequences be damned." "And you're different," Jacob managed, trying to steady his breathing. Matthias smiled, and there was something knowing in it, something that made Jacob's stomach flip. "I'm patient. I understand that some things are worth the wait, that the anticipation can be sweeter than the satisfaction." He reached out, his fingers catching a strand of hay from Jacob's hair. The gesture was tender, almost intimate, and somehow more devastating than Caleb's directness. His hand lingered, brushing against Jacob's temple, his touch feather-light. "Get some rest," Matthias said softly. "Tomorrow changes everything." Jacob climbed to the loft, his body humming with unfulfilled tension. Below, he heard the brothers talking, their voices a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He couldn't make out words, but he heard his name more than once, spoken in tones that ranged from concern to hungry, to something that sounded almost reverent. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams he couldn't quite remember, but that left him aching and restless when the rooster's crow pulled him back to consciousness. Dawn broke sharp and clear. Jacob descended the ladder to find both brothers already in the yard, their scythes gleaming in the early light. Caleb looked up first, his gaze raking over Jacob with undisguised hunger. "Ready to work, boy?" Jacob nodded, not trusting his voice. The wheat field stretched before them like a golden ocean, the stalks heavy with grain and swaying in the morning breeze. They worked in formation, Caleb on one side, Matthias on the other, Jacob between them. The rhythm was punishing. Swing, step, swing, step. The scythe grew heavy in Jacob's hands within the first hour, his shoulders burning, sweat soaking through his shirt. But he didn't falter. He matched their pace, driven by pride and something deeper, something he was only beginning to understand. He wanted to prove himself worthy of their attention, of the patience Matthias showed and the hunger he saw in Caleb's eyes. When the sun reached its zenith, they paused for water. Jacob gulped from the canteen, droplets spilling down his chin and throat. He didn't notice both brothers watching until Caleb spoke. "You're doing better than I expected." Matthias handed Jacob a cloth to wipe his face. "Better than most men twice your age would manage." The praise warmed him more than it should have. Jacob ducked his head, suddenly self-conscious under their combined attention. He could feel the weight of their gazes like physical pressure against his skin. They returned to work, but the dynamic had shifted. Caleb moved closer, his body occasionally brushing against Jacob's as they worked side by side. Each contact was brief but electric, sending sparks of awareness through Jacob's nervous system. Matthias mirrored the movement from the other side, creating a subtle pressure, a constant awareness of being caught between them. By afternoon, Jacob's shirt clung to his skin, transparent with sweat. The heat was oppressive, the sun beating down without mercy. Without thinking, driven by pure physical need for relief, he peeled the shirt off and tossed it aside, desperate for any respite from the suffocating heat. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. When Jacob looked up, both brothers had stopped working. Caleb's jaw was tight, his knuckles white around the scythe handle. Matthias's eyes had gone dark, his chest rising and falling with carefully controlled breaths. "What?" Jacob asked, suddenly uncertain, feeling vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with his lack of clothing. "Nothing," Matthias said, his voice strained. "Keep working." But Caleb didn't look away. "You have no idea what you do. To us, do you?" Jacob's mouth went dry. "I was just hot, I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." Caleb drove his scythe into the earth with more force than necessary and stalked forward. "And I know what you didn't mean. That's the problem." He stopped inches from Jacob, close enough that the heat radiating from his body was palpable even in the afternoon sun. "Every day you're here, you test our restraint a little more. Walking around, looking like that, responding to every touch like you've been starving for it your whole life." "Caleb," Matthias warned, his tone sharp. But Caleb ignored him. His hand rose, palm pressing flat against Jacob's bare chest, right over his racing heart. "Feel that? That's not fear. That's want. Raw and honest and so clear I could read it blind." Jacob trembled under the touch, unable to move, unable to speak. The contact seemed to burn, Caleb's palm hot against his skin. "My brother thinks I'll scare you off if I push too hard," Caleb continued, his voice dropping to something almost tender despite the intensity of his words. "But I see something different when I look at you. I see someone who's tired of running from what he is. Someone who wants to be claimed, even if he won't say it out loud." Matthias appeared at Jacob's other side, his presence grounding. "You're overwhelming him." "Am I?" Caleb's eyes never left Jacob's face, searching, demanding truth. "Are you overwhelmed, Jacob?" The question hung in the humid air. Jacob's mind spun, every instinct screaming at him to flee, to protect himself from this dangerous vulnerability. But his body had other ideas. His heart raced beneath Caleb's palm, his skin flushed with more than just exertion, his breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the work. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "I'm not overwhelmed." Caleb's smile was slow and triumphant. "Good, because tonight after supper, we're going to have a conversation, a real one, about what happens next, about what you want and what we're willing to give." He stepped back, releasing Jakob from the magnetic pull of his proximity. Matthias's hand settled briefly on Jakob's shoulder, a steadying touch, warm and reassuring, before he too returned to his scythe. They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon, but the air between them crackled with promise and threat and possibility. Supper was a quiet affair. Jacob barely tasted the stew Matthias had prepared, too aware of the brothers exchanging glances across the rough wooden table. When the meal ended, Caleb pushed back his chair with a scrape of wood on wood. "Jakob, stay. Matthias and I need to talk with you." Jakob's heart hammered as Matthias began clearing the dishes, moving with deliberate slowness. When the table was clean, both brothers sat back down, flanking Jakob on either side. "You've been here 2 weeks now," Matthias began, his tone careful, measured. "Long enough to understand how things work on this ranch, how isolated we are, how far from judgment or prying eyes." Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Out here, a man can live however he chooses, can want whatever he wants, can take what's offered freely without shame or consequence." Jacob's throat constricted. "What are you asking me?" "We're not asking anything," Matthias said gently. "We're offering a place here that's more than just work, more than just food and shelter." Caleb's hand found Jakob's knee under the table, warm and steady. "We're offering ourselves, both of us, in whatever way you're willing to accept." The words hit Jakob like a physical blow. He'd known on some level where this was heading, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified and exhilarated him. I've never... Jakob struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal too much, wouldn't make him vulnerable. "We know," Matthias said. "That's why we're being clear now. This isn't about taking advantage. This is about giving you a choice with full knowledge of what we're offering." Caleb's grip tightened slightly. "My brother had his turn with you this week, teaching you, gentling you, making you comfortable with our touch. Now it's my turn to show you what comes next, to push you past comfortable into something more." Jacob's breath came in short gasps. Every nerve ending felt alive, electric with anticipation and fear. "And if I say no, then you say no," Matthias answered immediately, his voice firm. "You stay on as hired help. We keep our distance, and nothing changes except that we respect your boundary." "But if you say yes?" Caleb leaned closer, his mouth near Jakob's ear, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through Jakob's chest. "If you say yes, then tonight becomes the first night of something new, something that will test every limit you thought you had." Jacob closed his eyes, his mind racing. He thought of the months of wandering, of sleeping alone under cold stars, of the aching loneliness that had driven him to this remote ranch in the first place. He thought of Matthias's patient hands, guiding him through tasks with infinite care, of Caleb's fierce intensity, the way his gaze made Jacob feel seen in a way he'd never experienced. He thought of what it meant to be wanted, really wanted, not for what he could provide or what he represented, but for himself. When he opened his eyes, both brothers were watching him with an intensity that should have been frightening, but instead felt like coming home. Yes, Jacob whispered. I say yes. The transformation was immediate. Caleb's hand slid higher on Jacob's thigh, possessive and sure. Matthias rose from his chair, circling around behind Jacob, his hands coming to rest on the younger man's shoulders. Stand up, Caleb commanded, his voice rough with restrained hunger. Jacob obeyed on shaking legs. Matthias's hands slid down his arms, steadying him, while Caleb stood and closed the distance between them. First rule, Caleb said, his eyes burning into Jacob's. Out here, you don't hide. Not from us, not from yourself. Whatever you're feeling, you let us see it. Jacob nodded, unable to form words. Second rule, Matthias murmured from behind him, his breath warm against Jacob's neck. You trust us. We won't hurt you, won't push you further than you can handle. But you have to trust that we know what we're doing. I trust you, Jacob managed, and was surprised to find it was true. Caleb's hand cupped Jacob's face, thumb tracing his cheekbone with unexpected gentleness. Then let go. Stop thinking, stop fighting, just feel. What followed was a lesson in sensation, in surrender, in discovering parts of himself Jacob had kept locked away for so long. He'd forgotten they existed. Caleb's touch was demanding, relentless, pushing Jacob to respond, to react, to give voice to needs he'd never acknowledged. Matthias balanced it with tenderness, with patient exploration, with whispered reassurances that made Jacob feel cherished rather than claimed. They worked in tandem. These brothers who knew each other so well, they moved as one entity. When Caleb's intensity threatened to overwhelm, Matthias was there to ground him. When Matthias's gentleness left Jacob yearning for more, Caleb provided it without hesitation. Time lost meaning, the cabin filled with the sounds of ragged breathing, of skin against skin, of murmured words that were half encouragement, half worship. Jacob learned the taste of surrender, the power in vulnerability, the strange freedom that came from letting go of control. He learned that Caleb's fierceness masked a deep well of tenderness, revealed only in unguarded moments, when he pressed kisses to Jacob's temple and whispered words of praise. He learned that Matthias's patience could transform into breathtaking intensity when his restraint finally broke, his careful control giving way to raw need. Most of all, he learned what it felt like to be wanted completely, without shame or hesitation, to be the focus of such concentrated attention, to have two men dedicated entirely to his pleasure and comfort. When it was over, Jacob lay between them in Caleb's wide bed, his body humming with exhaustion and satisfaction. Caleb's arm was thrown possessively across his chest, while Matthias's fingers traced idle patterns along his spine. You good? Matthias asked quietly. Jacob nodded, not trusting his voice. His throat felt raw, his eyes burned with unshed tears of relief and release. Caleb pressed a kiss to his temple, surprisingly gentle. You did well. Better than well. You're stronger than you know. What happens now? Jacob whispered into the darkness. The brothers exchanged a glance over his head. Matthias answered first. Now you sleep. Tomorrow we finish the harvest. And the day after, we start building you a proper room. Can't have you in the loft anymore. You're ours now, Caleb added, his voice rough, with emotion. That means you stay, not as hired help, but as part of this, part of us, part of what we're building here. Jacob's eyes burned with tears he wouldn't let fall. I don't know how to be what you need. You already are, Matthias assured him, his hand warm and steady on Jacob's back. Everything else we'll figure out together, one day at a time. Jacob closed his eyes, letting their warmth surround him. Outside, the harvest moon had begun its descent, painting the ranch in silver light. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more moments of discovery. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of the two men who had seen past his defenses to the truth beneath, Jacob finally understood what home felt like. The harvest continued for 2 more weeks, each day a rhythm of labor and learning. Jacob worked between the brothers, his body growing stronger, his confidence building. The nights belonged to exploration, to pushing boundaries and discovering new depths of connection. Caleb taught him strength, how to demand what he wanted, how to take as well as give. Matthias taught him patience, the value of anticipation, the power of a touch withheld until the perfect moment. Together, they taught him that love could exist in forms the world outside would never understand or accept. That family could be forged in choices rather than blood. That belonging was something you created, not something you were born into. When the last sheaf of wheat was cut and bound, the three of them stood in the empty field, watching the sun set over land. They would work together, land that was now as much Jacob's as theirs. "Next year," Caleb said, his arm around Jacob's shoulders, heavy and warm, "we'll need to expand, plant more acreage. We'll need more hands," Matthias agreed, his hand resting on Jacob's lower back, proprietary and tender. Jacob looked between them, seeing not just the men who had claimed him, but the partners who had chosen to build something lasting. "Then we'll find them, together." The ranch house glowed warm in the gathering darkness, smoke curling from the chimney, promising heat and food and the comfort of shared space. Jacob had arrived here with nothing but a worn satchel and desperate hope. He was leaving behind the frightened boy who had climbed that loft ladder 2 months ago. In his place stood a man who knew his own worth, who had learned to embrace desire without shame, who had found his place in the world. The Dalton brothers had taken turns with him, yes. Caleb had pushed him past every boundary, testing his limits and showing him strengths he didn't know he possessed. Matthias had stretched his understanding of what tenderness could mean, teaching him that patience and passion were not opposites but partners. But what they had given him in return was immeasurable. They had given him purpose, belonging, and a love that defied easy definition. As they walked back to the house, 3 bodies moving in perfect synchronization, Jacob understood that some stories didn't follow the expected path. Some families were forged in fire and sealed with choices that the outside world would never comprehend. But out here, on this isolated ranch where the land stretched endlessly and the only law was the one they made themselves, Jacob had found exactly what he'd been searching for all along. He had found home. He had found family. He had found himself. And tomorrow, they would begin building the room that would be his, adding his permanent presence to the structure of their lives. The foundation had been laid in those first uncertain weeks, built brick by brick through work and trust and willing surrender. Now came the rest of their lives, stretching out before them like the endless prairie, full of possibility and promise, and the kind of love that required no explanation beyond the simple truth. They belonged to each other, and that was enough. The construction of Jacob's room began on a crisp morning in late autumn, when the harvest was fully stored and the cattle had been moved to winter pasture. The brothers worked with the same coordinated efficiency they brought to everything, measuring and cutting timber, while Jacob mixed mortar and carried supplies. They'd chosen a spot on the eastern side of the house, where morning sun would warm the space, and Jacob would wake to golden light. Caleb insisted on a large window, arguing that Jacob deserved a view of the land he now helped work. Matthias designed shelving into the walls, anticipating books and personal belongings that Jacob might accumulate over time. It was this casual assumption of permanence that moved Jacob most deeply. They weren't building him a temporary shelter or a hired hand's quarters. They were creating a space that acknowledged his presence as essential to the structure of their home, their lives, their future. "What do you think?" Matthias asked one afternoon, standing beside Jacob as they surveyed the framed walls. "Will it suit you?" Jacob struggled to find words. The room was larger than anywhere he'd ever slept, with space for a real bed, a desk, a chair by the window. "It's too much," he managed finally. Caleb looked up from where he was hammering floorboards. "Nothing's too much for you? You're family now, Jacob. This is your home as much as ours. Family." The word settled into Jacob's chest with the weight of an anchor, grounding him in ways he'd never experienced. He'd been orphaned young, cast out by his remaining kin, spent years drifting with no one to claim him or be claimed by. And now these 2 men, these brothers who'd taken him in on nothing more than instinct, were offering him something he'd thought forever lost. "I don't know how to thank you," Jacob said quietly. "Then don't." Matthias's hand settled on his shoulder, warm and steady. Just stay. Just be part of what we're building here. That's all the thanks we need." The room took shape over the following weeks, and with it, Jacob's understanding of his place in their world deepened. He learned that Caleb rose earliest, always the first to check the livestock and survey the land in the pre-dawn darkness. He learned that Matthias sang while he cooked, unconscious melodies that filled the house with warmth. He learned the rhythm of their days, the comfortable silences and easy conversation, the way they moved around each other with practiced grace. And he learned the nights, the sweet intimacy of being wanted by two men who brought such different gifts to their shared bed. Caleb's fierce passion that swept Jacob away like a flash flood, leaving him breathless and remade. Matthias's patient exploration that taught Jacob his own body was capable of sensations he'd never imagined. But more than the physical connection, Jacob discovered emotional depths he'd kept locked away for so long he'd forgotten they existed. The brothers encouraged him to speak his mind, to express his needs and fears and dreams. They listened when he talked about his past, offering comfort without pity, understanding without judgment. One night, wrapped in blankets by the fire with Caleb on one side and Matthias on the other, Jacob found himself speaking of his father, of the night he'd been discovered with the blacksmith's son, of his father's rage and disgust, of being thrown into the street with curses ringing in his ears. "I thought something was broken in me," Jacob admitted, staring into the flames. "Thought I was wrong somehow, that the desires I felt made me less than human." Caleb's arm tightened around his shoulders. "The only thing broken was your father's capacity for love. Real love doesn't come with conditions, Jacob. It accepts and celebrates, doesn't demand you contort yourself into something you're not." "Out here," Matthias added, his fingers threading through Jacob's hair, "we make our own definitions of family, of love, of what it means to belong to someone. The world outside can keep its narrow rules and rigid expectations. We live by our own code." Jacob leaned into their warmth, feeling tears he'd held back for years finally breaking free. They didn't rush to comfort him or tell him to stop crying. They simply held him, letting him release the grief and shame he'd carried alone for so long. When the storm passed, Jacob felt lighter than he had in years, emptied out and refilled with something cleaner, something that felt like hope. Winter settled over the ranch with quiet intensity. Snow dusted the fields and ice glazed the water troughs each morning. The work shifted to maintenance and preparation, mending tools and tack, reinforcing structures against the cold. The three of them spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from books or simply sitting in companionable silence. Jacob's room was finished just before the first major snowfall. The brothers helped him move his few belongings from the loft, though they all knew he'd spend most nights in Caleb's larger bed, pressed between them in the darkness. "Your space," Matthias said, standing in the doorway as Jacob arranged his things. "Somewhere that's entirely yours, even if you don't always sleep here. Everyone needs a place that's theirs alone." Jacob understood what he meant. For all the intimacy they shared, there was wisdom in maintaining some boundaries, some private space where he could retreat when he needed solitude. He used the room more than he expected, spending afternoon hours at the desk, writing letters he'd never send, working through thoughts and feelings too complex for conversation. Sometimes one of the brothers would join him, sitting in the chair by the window while Jacob wrote, their presence comforting without being intrusive. The first Christmas on the ranch was unlike anything Jacob had experienced. The brothers approached it with enthusiasm that surprised him, decorating the house with pine boughs and wild holly, cooking elaborate meals, and presenting Jacob with gifts that revealed how closely they'd been paying attention to his interests. From Caleb, a leather-bound journal with his initials burned into the cover. "For your thoughts," Caleb said gruffly, looking almost embarrassed. "Matthias says you're always scribbling on scraps of paper. Figured you deserved something proper." From Matthias, a set of books, poetry and philosophy, stories of adventure and romance. "Saw you eyeing these in the mercantile," he explained. "Thought you might enjoy them." Jacob had nothing to offer in return but his gratitude, but they assured him his presence was gift enough. That night, They made love with a tenderness that brought tears to Jakob's eyes, and he fell asleep feeling cherished in ways he'd never dreamed possible. As winter deepened and spring approached, Jakob began to think about the future in concrete terms. He and the brothers discussed plans for expanding the ranch, adding more cattle, perhaps planting a larger garden. They talked about hiring additional help for the summer, debating what kind of men they should look for. "Someone like you," Caleb said one evening. "Someone who needs a chance and is willing to work for it." Jacob nodded, understanding what he meant. They would look for lost souls, for men the world had discarded or overlooked. They would offer the same gift that had been given to him, a home, a purpose, acceptance. The ranch was becoming more than just a place to work and live. It was becoming a refuge, a sanctuary for those who didn't fit the world's narrow expectations. And Jacob found himself excited by that vision, eager to help create something meaningful. One afternoon in early spring, while checking fence lines with Matthias, Jacob voiced a question that had been nagging at him for weeks. "Do you ever worry about people finding out? About what we are to each other?" Matthias considered this, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. "Sometimes. But then I remember that we're days from the nearest town, that most people mind their own business out here because they want the same courtesy extended to them. And I think about whether I'd rather live honestly in isolation or hide myself to gain acceptance from people whose opinions don't matter to me. And which do you choose?" "I choose this." Matthias gestured to the land around them, to the ranch visible in the distance. "I choose you and Caleb, this life we're building. I choose truth over comfort, every single time." Jacob nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to live authentically despite it. As they walked back to the house, Jacob realized how much he'd changed since that dusty afternoon when he'd first arrived. The frightened, half-starved boy was gone, replaced by a man who knew his worth, who understood what it meant to be valued, who had found his place in the world. That night, lying between Caleb and Matthias with their warmth surrounding him, Jacob thought about the journey that had brought him here. All the pain and loneliness, all the nights of despair had led to this moment. And while he wouldn't wish that suffering on anyone, he couldn't regret it either, because it had shaped him into someone capable of recognizing and accepting the gift these men offered. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness, not sure which of them he was addressing. Knowing it didn't matter because the words belonged to both, Caleb's arm tightened around him. "We know. We love you too." "Always have," Matthias added, his breath warm against Jakob's neck. "From the moment you walked onto this land, we just had to wait for you to catch up." Jacob smiled, his eyes drifting closed. Outside, the prairie wind sang through the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The sounds of the frontier, wild and untamed and beautiful. This was home. These men were his family. And whatever the future brought, they would face it together. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.